With characteristic flair, Eugene Peterson translates the opening verse of Psalm 130 like this: "Help, God, the bottom has fallen out of my life." A cry for God's mercy from someone who has hit rock bottom. A cry for help when everything you took for granted seems to have been taken away. I love the brutal honesty of the Psalms. There is nothing David or his fellow psalmists won't bring to God. Life through the Psalms is no bed of roses. Yes, there is the wonderful praise of God, thanksgiving for his good creation. Basically, praising God when all is as it should be. But many Psalms also speak into those times in our lives when everything is not as it should be. When God seems absent. When things fall apart at the seams. When things don't work out the way we want them to, in work or at home or in church. When we doubt our faith. When, as Eugene Peterson says, the bottom has fallen out of our world. Surely this psalm is a vital word for us today. I was speaking to my neighbour yesterday, across the fence and with 2 metre separation, of course. And something he said struck me. That his children, and I guess all of us, are living through their own history. That one day they will look back at this very strange period of time and say, I lived through that. It does feel a bit like the bottom has fallen out of our life, doesn't it? The things we have taken for granted, freedom to travel, freedom to shop, freedom to gather together with our friends and our families, freedom to work, have all been severely restricted in this last week or so. Now, as most of you know, I'm quite introverted. And so perhaps it comes as no surprise that there were a few jokes directed at me whenever all of this started. For example, as an introvert, you've been preparing for this your entire life. And so, while I'm more than happy in my own company, even for me, this enforced lockdown, this inability to meet together with my extended family, with friends, with colleagues, and with all of you, is difficult. It's something that I've never experienced before, and it's something that I certainly don't want to experience again. In this psalm, we see two very clear realities. The reality of suffering and the reality of God. Sometimes Christians think they ought to be immune from suffering. Perhaps they've heard some version of the health and wealth theology which underpins this understanding. But the reality of life is that we are human, and to be human means that we will experience suffering in some form or other during our life. Another thing we Christians try to do is to explain our suffering. And often we do this in terms of our sin. That I must have done something wrong to bring this suffering upon myself. Those are the sorts of things we might think. And while sometimes we may suffer the consequences of our actions, it's neither helpful nor accurate to think that all suffering can be explained in this way. It's perhaps the most cliched thing to say, but often the reality of suffering is simply this, that bad things happen to good people. The raw honesty of the psalmist before God. God, help me. The bottom has fallen out of my life. Seeks neither to deny the reality of suffering nor to explain it away. Suffering is there. He can do nothing but cry out to God for help. And that is our reality in the face of this coronavirus pandemic and all of the restrictions that it has brought to our lives. I have seen and heard some pretty rubbish theology in the past couple of weeks. That's another reason why social media is unhelpful. I've read that Christians are immune to coronavirus. Nonsense. I've read that this is a plague sent by God to punish the world. I've read that it's all predicted in the Bible. Whatever you believe, the reality is that the world is suffering because of coronavirus. People are suffering the effects of the virus. People are suffering too, through isolation, through scarcity, through fear, through unemployment. A further reality is that people everywhere continue to suffer through bereavement, through illness, through famine, poverty, oppression, and injustice. The things that the world has always suffered from and will continue to suffer from. And so our task is not to deny that we should suffer, not to wrestle with theological explanations as to why we suffer. The suffering is real. Our task is to cry out to God for help in the midst of the suffering, to cry out for ourselves and to cry out for our world. The psalmist cries out to a God he knows is there, to a God who listens, who forgives, who comes to those who wait, who is love and who will redeem. So what are we to do in the face of suffering, whether of the coronavirus kind or any other kind? Are we to wring our hands anxiously, wondering when it's all going to be over? The psalmist instructs us. We cry out to God and then we wait. I wait for the Lord. My whole being waits. And in His word I put my hope. I wait for the Lord more than watchmen wait for the morning. Hope-filled waiting is what we are called to do. To put our hope in a God who is entirely trustworthy, who has proved His faithfulness in the past and will do so again in the future. We are not called to demand of God what we want or what He should do or how He should do it. We're simply to pray and to wait for what God will say and what God will do. The final verses of the psalm speak words of promise and hope to us in these troubled days. Israel, put your hope in the Lord. For with the Lord is unfailing love, and with Him is full redemption. He Himself will redeem Israel from all their sins. We are to put our hope in the Lord. We are assured of His great love and mercy. In the depths of our suffering, Let us hold on to hope, for nothing is impossible with God. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. God is for us, and God is with us in our suffering. Let's remember that suffering, even death, is not the ultimate reality here. God's redemption is. The bottom may well have fallen out of our lives. But this psalm reminds us that no matter how deep the pit of despair we find ourselves in, it is not a bottomless pit. When we fix our eyes on God, we find hope as we watch and wait for him to act, to redeem us. And that is good news. Good news for today, good news for every day.